The lights of Rome had already faded that night when Yaman finally spoke, not on a stage, not in front of flashing cameras, but in a quiet corner of his apartment, where only the sound of his own heartbeat could be heard. He looked tired, not in the way an actor looks after a long shoot, but in the way a man looks when he's been carrying too much for too long. "I'm tired," he whispered, almost to himself. "I've learned, and now, I just want to be loved again." For a man who had built his image on strength, control, and silence, those words felt like an earthquake. The world knew Yaman, the successful actor, the international icon, the perfectionist who never showed weakness. But very few had seen the man behind the fame, the one who had lost more than he had ever admitted. Fame had given him everything: wealth, recognition, applause. But it had also taken something he could never replace: peace. Every relationship he had tried to build was shadowed by the weight of his name. Every moment of sincerity was questioned. Every gesture was interpreted, twisted, magnified. In the past, he had fought against the rumors, defended himself, and tried to show that there was still a human being beneath the idol. But lately, something had changed. He had stopped explaining. He had stopped pretending that everything was fine. Those who knew him best said they had never seen him so reflective, so distant, yet so genuine. The king who once smiled for every camera now avoided them. The man who used to chase perfection had started to crave something simpler: truth. And when he finally spoke those words, "I just want to be loved again," it wasn't about a new relationship or a romantic headline. It was a cry from a heart that had been misunderstood for too long. Behind that sentence was pain. The pain of being seen but never truly known, of being loved for an image and not for the soul behind it. That night in Rome wasn't about a new scandal or a secret revealed. It was about a man who had finally realized that love, not fame, was the only thing that had ever mattered. In the days that followed, his words spread like fire through social media: "I just want to be loved again." Fans around the world reposted it, wrote captions about heartbreak, and speculated endlessly. But none of them really understood what those words meant to him. For Can, love had never been simple. It had been tested, broken, and, in some cases, turned into a battlefield between truth and image. The moment he rose to fame, the line between the man and the myth began to blur. Every gesture, every look, every silence was analyzed as if it were part of a script. And yet, off-screen, he was just a man who wanted to trust someone enough to be himself. He had loved deeply once. The kind of love that doesn't need words, the kind that builds entire worlds out of glances. It was pure, intense, and real. But fame had a way of poisoning even the most beautiful things. The cameras didn't care about truth, they cared about stories. And when that story ended, the world didn't let him mourn it quietly. They demanded explanations, gossip, and sides. Since then, he had promised himself never to fall that hard again. But promises are fragile things. They shatter when loneliness grows louder than pride. He tried to fill the silence with work, projects, travels, charity events, interviews. Every morning he woke up as Yaman, the brand, the star, the untouchable figure people admired from a distance. But every night, when the makeup faded and the noise disappeared, he was just Can. A man who missed laughter that wasn't scripted, dinners that didn't have photographers waiting outside, messages that didn't begin with "I read about you." Sometimes he would scroll through old photos, not the public ones, but the ones no one else had seen. A smile, a shared glance, a moment before everything fell apart. And he would wonder, did she ever love me for me? That question haunted him more than any headline ever could. Because deep down, he didn't want applause. He didn't need admiration. He needed someone to look at him and see the man, not the myth. He had learned that success without love was a hollow victory. That no matter how high you climb, the view means nothing if you have no one to share it with. So when he finally spoke, it wasn't a publicity stunt or a cryptic message to stir gossip. It was the truth, raw, unfiltered, and painfully human. "I'm not asking for perfection," he said in a later interview. I'm just asking to be seen, to be loved, not for who people think I am, but for who I truly am." And in those words, there was both strength and surrender. For a long time, silence had been his only shield. Whenever the world accused him, whenever gossip pages twisted his words, he chose not to fight. That silence became his armor, but also his prison. Behind it, he carried the weight of everything he couldn't say. There was a time when Kim believed that silence was strength. That not reacting, not explaining, meant keeping control. But the truth was different. Silence, he learned, could also destroy you from within. Each unspoken truth became a stone, and one by one, those stones built the walls that separated him from the world. He remembered the night when everything changed. It wasn't on a red carpet or a film set, it was a simple night, alone with his thoughts. He looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself anymore. The smile that once came naturally now felt rehearsed. The confidence that had inspired millions had become a mask he no longer wanted to wear. He thought about the people he had lost along the way, the friends who couldn't keep up with his fame, the love that couldn't survive the spotlight, and the version of himself that disappeared somewhere between expectations and exhaustion. That realization hit him harder than any headline ever could. So he started over, quietly. No big announcements, no dramatic declarations. He began writing again, reading, walking without being recognized. He rediscovered the beauty in silence, not as a defense, but as peace. For the first time in years, he started to listen, to himself. To what he truly wanted, not what people expected from him. And that's when he understood, he didn't want to be adored, he wanted to be understood. He didn't crave perfection, he longed for presence. It was during this silent transformation that the sentence came out of him naturally, "I just want to be loved again." It wasn't a weakness, it was his truth. Because love, he realized, was not about applause or attention. It was about the quiet certainty of being accepted, flaws and all. He wasn't asking for a fairy tale. He was asking for something real. Someone who could sit beside him in silence and still feel close. Someone who could see the man, not the actor. And that's why his confession touched so many hearts. Because behind the fame, the strength, and the image, there was a man who had learned the hardest lesson of all. That even the strongest souls need love to survive. Days turned into weeks, and the noise around his confession slowly faded. But for Can, something inside had shifted forever. He was no longer chasing headlines, nor running from them. For the first time in years, he was simply living, quietly, honestly, and at peace with himself. He began to rediscover the little things that fame had stolen: early morning walks, coffee without cameras, laughter that wasn't rehearsed. People who met him during this period said there was something different about him, a softness in his eyes, a calmness that hadn't been there before. The storm had passed, and what remained was a man who had survived it. He started to travel again, but this time not for premieres or interviews. He would disappear to small coastal towns, where no one cared who he was, where he could sit at a cafe for hours, watching the sea and writing in his notebook. There, in the simplicity of anonymity, he found what he had been missing: authenticity. He began writing about love again, not as a script, not as fiction, but as truth. His notes were filled with reflections. Love is not about grand gestures. It's about presence. It's the silence between two people who understand each other without words. For the first time, he didn't write about what he had lost, but about what he had learned. That love doesn't destroy you, it transforms you. That heartbreak isn't the end, it's the beginning of self-understanding. Those who had seen him years ago, restless, fiery, always guarded, now saw a man who had learned how to breathe again. He smiled more easily. He talked less, but when he did, his words carried weight. "I don't regret the pain," he said in a quiet moment to a close friend. "It taught me who I am. It showed me what I don't want. And now, I'm ready to love without fear." He no longer looked for perfection, but connection. He didn't want someone to fix him, only someone who would stay when the cameras turned off. The world often imagines that celebrities live untouched by loneliness. But Ken had learned that fame could be the loneliest place of all. What saved him wasn't applause or success, it was the courage to admit that he needed love as much as anyone else. And that confession, that single sentence, "I just want to be loved again," became his quiet rebirth. It wasn't a headline anymore. It was a truth whispered to the universe, and finally, the universe was listening. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in gold and soft orange, when Yaman stood by his window, looking out at the horizon. It was the same view he had seen countless times before, but tonight, it felt different. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he had become. He had walked through the chaos of fame, through love that burned too bright and ended too soon. He had faced betrayal, loneliness, and silence. But through it all, he had found something far more valuable than applause or admiration: himself. In the quiet of that moment, he realized that life had never been about chasing perfection. It had been about learning to live honestly, to love bravely, and to forgive deeply, especially himself. He thought about the woman he had once loved, about the nights filled with laughter, the fights that left scars, and the goodbyes that broke him. He no longer felt bitterness, only gratitude. Because she, too, had been a teacher, one who had shown him both the beauty and the cost of love. "I used to think love had to be loud," he whispered to himself, "but now I know, the real kind of love is quiet. It doesn't demand. It stays." He turned off his phone that night. No notifications, no cameras, no interruptions. Just silence. And in that silence, he smiled. Not because he was happy in the way the world defines it, but because he finally understood that peace was not found in someone else's arms, it began within him. Friends who saw him in the following weeks said he was glowing again. Not the kind of glow you get from fame or success, but the kind that comes from inner calm. He had stopped running, stopped explaining, stopped proving. He was simply being. He began working on a new project, one deeply personal, not a film or series, but something that reflected his journey. A book, perhaps, or a foundation to help young artists navigate the brutal world of fame without losing themselves. For once, his work was not about showing the world who he was, it was about sharing who he had become. In a recent interview, when asked if he still believed in love, he smiled gently and said, "Of course I do. I never stopped. Love isn't something you lose. It's something you return to, when you're ready." And the audience watching him that day saw it, the sincerity in his eyes, the calm in his voice, the quiet confidence of a man who had found his truth. Yaman was no longer the man who needed to prove his worth. He was no longer the heartbroken lover hiding behind fame. He was a man reborn, one who had learned, fallen, risen, and learned again. And somewhere deep inside, beyond the noise of fame and the whispers of the past, his heart whispered one last truth: "I'm not afraid anymore. I've been tired. I've learned. And now, I'm ready to be loved again." The world might call it a confession. But for Can, it was something else entirely, a beginning.